In the first issue of The Seeds by Ann Nocenti and David Aha, the 9-panel grid is all over the place. It's something I've done a few episodes on before with Strip Panel Naked, but Aha has his own specific sensibilities throughout the first issue that I thought was worth discussing, and seeing one specific creator's way of using the grid as a mirroring device within storytelling. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So what I wanted to discuss was the small pool of ways that Aha and Nocenti use the grid system, when specifically on a whole 9-panel page. There's really only two main things we see as well repeated throughout this issue, and it seems to speak to the philosophy of Aha and Nocenti and how to treat the comics page when gridded like this, and it is a little different than what I've talked about in other episodes. So previously, for example, I mentioned the central panel of a 9-panel grid being kind of particularly important in anchoring the whole page, and images sort of kind of spinning around that. Instead, they like to treat each row of 3 panels as its own device, and mostly they are consumed like that too. Each page is doing its thing, but visually the images seem sectioned off into their own set of 3 on each tier. The very first page in this issue gives a good example of that too. You can see how each tier has its own image progression, different from the others, even though this is technically still the same zoom out across all of the 9 panels. So the page is doing the entire thing itself, but it's always broken up specifically into tiers of separated imagery. As you see, each tier has its own little mini zoom, and each tier is based around an individual bit of imagery, however the entire page is doing the entire zoom. And this page also shows one of the 2 ways in which Aha routinely treats 3-panel tiers, which is by having a progression zoom. Each of these images starts on a close-up, and then zooms out over the next 2 panels. I mean, that is broken by the 3rd tier, which has a zoom in rather than a zoom out, but the effect is essentially built the same way. Aha and Nocenti choose to have the 3 panels be a progression of a camera move, or a reframing but within the same scene. And it creates a good sense of drama and movement, like we're moving through space and the world. It works simply and pretty obviously by keeping the exact same panel size, which means that we tend to focus just on the contents of the panel and nothing else because it's removing those distractions. And then by offering up a little of whatever was in the previous panel again in the subsequent one. So for example, on the top tier we see parts of the hexagons, on the 2nd tier we see elements of the bees, and on the 3rd tier we see that little sliver of the bee that remains in the 2nd panel. Simple. And most of the time with this, the through line is really just in the center of the image. Most of the time your eye line or the focal point of the image is in the same place as it goes panel to panel to panel. But Aha still likes to bounce you around the panels, and actually this is something you see in his approach to lettering the book. He'll place captions at the top or bottom of the panel, and on the next panel he'll flip that. So on the 2nd panel here, the caption's at the top, moving on to the bottom on panel 3. And as I say about them treating each of these tiers as a separate piece of imagery, it does reset with each tier. So here on panel 4 it's at the bottom, panel 5 at the top, panel 6 at the bottom. So Aha is trying to move you around even though the focal point stays mostly in that middle area. He's creating additional movement with his placing of these caption boxes. And the zoom effect on this page can be found on quite a number of pages as well. So here's an example with a camera, here's one with a chain link fence, here's one with the bees. I said that's one technique out of 2, and this second technique is probably going to be split into 2 subversions, but it's essentially the same thing. Aha will play with having 2 bits of imagery that's quite similar, and a 3rd that offsets the look of the rest of the tier. And it's used in 2 ways, so this is the 2 subsets. Either having the offsetting panel at the beginning or end of the tier, so there's 2 panels of similar imagery next to each other, or having the offsetting panel be in the middle of the tier, so it breaks up the 2 other images. As an example of the latter, here's a page which contains 3 examples of it. In this case, the offsetting image of the first tier is Lola in the middle, cutting between 2 images of race. It then reverses for the next tier before landing on the same again. A page later is 2 other examples which have Race and Lola in more or less the same position, and using a glitchy panel in the middle as the offset. So the tier below reverses it, putting the magpie in the middle and the glitching on either side, and you can use this technique with either panels that are almost identical, like so, or just with things that visually have a clear and noticeable link, like a close-up on a character. They all serve to do the same job, which is to make one of these panels stand out. The middle glitching panel here on the I have to caption, it pops a lot more because it's being placed next to images that look really different from it. So it creates a rhythm and it creates a power. If you place these 3 glitching panels just all next to each other with everything more or less the same, you get the sense that they're glitching, but the glitching kind of loses its meaning, it loses its effect. Here, by doing this, you can bounce it off other images around it. In this same sequence, we also get a look at the other version of this, which is to place the offsetting panel at the start or the end. Here the glitchy panel sits at the start before cutting to 2 images of Lola. And again, it works to add a strong beat to the start of the sequence by having an image that doesn't visually replicate the rest of the tier. So you've got this glitch, and this glitch stands out, and then the rest of the scene carries on as normal, but the glitch is the main thing you'll take away from that set of panels. I also chose this example because I like that it combines the effect with the zoom out style I mentioned at the top of the episode. Here each image is pushing out and pushing out, going from the close-up of the hands and then ending on this wider shot of Lola, which shows that you can also start to combine these styles into a third one that pushes movement and therefore focus, while still giving particular power to an image on that tier. And that, with a very small handful of exceptions, is everything you'll find on a 3-panel tier in Aha and Nocenti's work on this first issue of the Seeds. The addition of a 9-panel grid to a comic tends to bring with it a very specific rhythm and pattern to the images, and Aha is just bringing his own kind of unique twist on that, almost calling back more to the idea of 3-panel strips stacked on top of each other, treating each row as its own set of images and a mini sequence within the page. And if you can do that, what you can do is create a good rhythm to the page, because each tier is going to be satisfying to a reader. I can notice that pattern, see that rhythm, and I'll get something from each tier, and so reading an entire 9-panel page like that feels incredibly satisfying. I'm not just getting a payoff on each scene, I'm not just getting a payoff on each page, I'm getting a payoff every 3 panels. And it's a big part as to why this issue works as well as it does, bouncing and bounding along with a controlled speed and asking you to notice not just the images, but the way they interact with each other. Thanks for watching. Strip Panel Naked continues to exist regularly because of the amazing support from the patrons, who get access to years worth of exclusive extra writing and content. I'd love your support too. You can find me on Twitter at HassanOE and the Eisner nominated magazine I edit at panelxpanel.com. As always, hit subscribe and that notification bell to keep up to date with all the new episodes, and I'll see you next time.